There's a particular kind of phone call that arrives dressed up as a courtesy, but is really a test. It comes after the pressure has already been applied, after the threats have been made public, after the other side has had a few days to sit in the discomfort. And when that call finally lands, the person who placed it usually expects one of two things on the other end of the line: relief or surrender, sometimes both. Because by the time you're picking up the phone, the story goes, you've already decided you can't win the standoff. And now you just want to find out how much it's going to cost you to end it. That's the call Donald Trump placed to Mark Carney this week, days after Washington dropped a 50% tariff wall on a targeted list of Canadian goods using a legal weapon almost nobody outside a handful of trade lawyers had even heard of. The President of the United States reached out to the Prime Minister of Canada to talk. And on the surface, most of the coverage treated it exactly the way you'd expect. Two leaders, one phone call, an agreement to intensify trade talks in the coming weeks, cordial, constructive, a de-escalation, move along. Nothing to see here, but that framing misses the entire point. And it's the reason I wanted to sit down and walk through this one carefully. Because the interesting thing about that call is not that it happened. It's what Carney said back. It's the answer he gave, the tone he used, and the one thing he refused to put on the table before the conversation even started. That answer is why this negotiation does not look anything like the one Washington thought it was walking into. And by the end of this video, I think you'll see why the phone call that was supposed to bring Canada to heel actually did the opposite. I'm going to break down what really changed in that exchange, why Carney's response caught Washington slightly off balance, and what it tells us about where this whole confrontation is heading over the next several weeks. And stick with me, because near the end, I'm going to give you the honest counter argument, the part that almost nobody covering this is willing to say out loud. The reason this might still go sideways for Canada, no matter how well Carney played the moment, because I don't do cheerleading on this channel, I do analysis. Let's get into it. First, the setup, because you can't understand the phone call without understanding what came right before it. On the 20th, the White House imposed a 50% tariff on a specific list of Canadian goods, not the broad everything across the board threat we've been hearing about for weeks. A surgical list: wine, dairy, cement, certain plastics, and yes, hockey sticks. And the tool they reached for wasn't the usual national security justification or the trade remedy process everyone's used to arguing over. It was Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a statute so old and so rarely used that most people encountering it for the first time assumed it was a typo. A law written during the Great Depression dusted off nearly a century later and pointed directly at Ottawa. Now, the White House fact sheet that accompanied it said the quiet part loud. These new tariffs were designed to override the duty-free treatment that Canadian goods are supposed to enjoy under the trade agreement between the two countries. In other words, Washington wasn't pretending this fit inside the rules. It was openly reaching outside the rules, using an obscure Depression-era clause to punch a hole straight through the deal that's supposed to govern North American trade. And the list itself, the wine, the dairy, the cement, the hockey sticks, that wasn't random. That was chosen. It was chosen to sting culturally, to make headlines, to make ordinary Canadians feel the tariff in things they recognize as their own. So that's the environment Carney was sitting in when the phone rang. He'd already made his position clear in the days before. He called it a violation of the agreement, which it plainly is. But here's the part that a lot of people found confusing, and it's the part I want you to hold on to because it becomes the whole story. He called it a violation, and in almost the same breath, he signaled he was still open to talking. He did not slam the door. He did not announce a retaliatory tariff of his own. He did not match Washington's 50% with a 50% of his own the way a lot of Canadians wanted him to. And to a lot of people, that looked soft. It looked like hesitation. It looked like a prime minister who'd been hit hard and was flinching. I saw the comments. I saw the takes. Where's the fight? Where's the retaliation? Why is he being so calm while Trump is throwing punches? And I understand the frustration. I really do. But I want you to consider a different reading because I think what looked like softness was actually the most deliberate move on the board. Because when you refuse to fire back immediately, you keep something. You keep the ability to choose the moment. You keep the moral high ground. And most importantly, you keep the other side guessing about what you'll do, which is far more unsettling to a negotiator than a predictable tit for tat. Now, the call itself, Trump reached out, and the two of them, according to what came out afterward, agreed to intensify negotiations over the coming weeks. And here's where you have to slow down and actually think about the mechanics of what that means. Because the word intensify is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and both sides are using it to mean very different things. From Washington's side, intensify means leverage. It means we've got the 50% tariff live. The clock is running. Your exporters are already feeling it. So let's sit down fast and let's settle this on terms that reflect the pressure we've applied. The tariff isn't separate from the negotiation. The tariff is the negotiation. It's the thumb on the scale. That's how Trump negotiates. And he's never really hidden it. You create the pain. You keep the pain running, and you use the running clock to force a deal before the other side can adjust. But listen to what Carney actually agreed to, and more importantly, what he didn't. He agreed to intensify talks. He did not agree to negotiate under the tariff as a precondition. He did not accept the 50% as the new baseline reality that both sides now build from. And that distinction, subtle as it sounds, is the entire ball game. Because if Canada sits down and treats the 50% tariff as the starting point, then every concession Canada wins is measured against a wall that Washington built illegitimately. You'd be negotiating your way back to zero and calling it a victory. That's the trap. That's how you lose while thinking you're winning. Carney didn't step into that. His answer, in effect, was yes, let's talk, and let's talk seriously. But the 50% tariff is not a fact of life we're now bargaining around. It's the illegitimate act we're bargaining about. The tariff isn't the floor. The tariff is the thing on trial. And that reframing, done quietly without a dramatic press conference, without matching Trump's theatrics, is what changed the shape of the negotiation before it even properly began. Let me put it in plainer terms because I think this is where it clicks. Imagine someone breaks your window, then knocks on your door and says, "Great news, I'm willing to discuss how we fix your window." One version of you says, "Okay, thank you. Let's talk about the window." And now you've accepted the broken window as the situation you're solving. The other version of you says, "Sure, let's talk. We're going to talk about the fact that you broke my window and about the bill for it." Same conversation on the surface. Completely different power dynamic underneath. Carney chose the second version, and he did it without raising his voice, which is exactly why it works. Now, why does that matter so much in this specific case? Because of Section 338, because of that Depression-era statute Washington reached for. And here's the thing about reaching for an obscure 95-year-old law that almost nobody uses. You don't reach for the weird, dusty tool at the back of the shed when the normal tools are working fine. You reach for it when the normal tools don't fit. The choice of Section 338 is itself a confession. It tells you that the more conventional legal justifications, the ones Washington has leaned on before, were getting shakier. The national security angle had been stretched thin. The trade remedy processes have their own rules and their own timelines and their own inconvenient requirements for evidence. Section 338 was the improvisation. And improvisation in a legal fight is a sign of weakness, dressed up as boldness. Carney's team, and this is the part I really want you to appreciate, almost certainly saw that when you've spent your career, as Carney has, sitting at the intersection of finance, law, and national power, running the Bank of Canada through one crisis and the Bank of England through another, you develop a very specific instinct for the difference between a strong hand played loudly and a weak hand played loudly. Trump plays every hand loudly. That's the style. But the volume tells you nothing about the cards. And Carney appears to have looked at the 50% tariff, looked at the strange old statute holding it up, and concluded that the loudness was covering for a legal foundation that could not survive real scrutiny, which is why he didn't panic, which is why he didn't retaliate in kind. Because if you believe the other side's move is legally hollow, the worst thing you can do is respond with your own legally questionable move that muddies the water and gives them cover. The smartest thing you can do is stay clean, stay calm, keep pointing at the hole in their case, and agree to talk on the condition that their illegitimate act is what's on the table. You let the weakness of their position do the work over time. And here's where the phone call flips from a Washington win into something much more uncomfortable for the White House, because Trump made the call. Think about that for a second. In the story, the pressure campaign was supposed to tell, Canada calls Washington. Canada, feeling the 50% bite, picks up the phone, asks for relief, comes to the table hat in hand. That's the script. That's what the tariff was supposed to produce. But that's not what happened. The President of the United States reached out to the Prime Minister of Canada, and whatever you want to say about the diplomatic niceties of who calls whom, the optics of that are not the optics of a country that's winning cleanly. You don't generally chase the person you've already cornered. If the pressure were working exactly as designed, Washington could have simply waited for Ottawa to break. The fact that the call came from the American side tells you there's a clock ticking on Washington too, and it's worth naming what's on that clock. Those 50% tariffs don't only hit Canadian exporters, they hit American importers, American businesses that rely on those goods, American consumers who end up paying more. Cement matters to American construction. Dairy and wine matter to American shelves and American restaurants. When you build a tariff wall, you're not just blocking the other guy's goods from coming in. You're taxing your own people for the privilege of buying them. And that cost shows up fast in prices, in supply headaches, in the complaints that flow back to Washington from the industries caught in the middle. So both sides have a clock. And this is the piece, the de-escalation, nothing to see. Here coverage keeps missing. The negotiation didn't get intense because Canada folded. It got intense because both sides have reasons to want it resolved. And Carney's refusal to accept the tariff as the baseline means the resolution can't just be Canada buying its way back to normal. It has to actually address the thing Washington did. That's a very different negotiation than the one that was advertised. Let me widen the lens for a moment because there's a bigger structural story sitting underneath this phone call, and it's the thing that gives Carney his real leverage. Earlier this month, the United States declined to extend the North American Trade Agreement at the scheduled joint review. The U.S. Trade Representative signaled the deal is, in his words, not renewed, which kicked the whole arrangement into an annual review cycle instead of the long-term stability it used to provide. And a lot of people read that as bad news for Canada, another sign of American willingness to blow up the framework. But look at it from the other direction. An annual review cycle means this doesn't get settled once and then locked away for a decade. It means the terms are live every year on a rolling basis. It means the leverage doesn't expire. And here's why that helps the calmer player rather than the louder one. Trump's whole method depends on urgency, deadlines, countdown clocks, pain now, deal now before you can adjust. But a rolling annual review is the enemy of urgency. It's a structure that rewards patience, that rewards the side willing to diversify its options and wait, that rewards exactly the kind of long game temperament Carney has spent his entire career building. When the framework itself resets every year, the country that can absorb a rough year and keep building alternatives has the advantage over the country that needs a fast, dramatic win to satisfy a domestic audience and an election calendar. So when Carney says, sure, let's intensify the talks, he's not agreeing to a sprint. He's agreeing to a race whose track he understands better than the person who challenged him to it. He knows the deal is already in an annual cycle. He knows the 50% tariff is resting on a shaky 95-year-old statute. He knows the American call came first. And he knows that the more Canada quietly widens its trade options, its energy routes, its export markets, the less that single 50% wall means over time. That's the answer that changed the negotiation. Not a soundbite, a stance. Now, let me show you the difference in how the two men are playing this, because it's almost a study in opposites. Trump negotiates in public. Everything is a post, a letter, a headline, a number designed to dominate the news cycle. The tariff on hockey sticks isn't really about hockey sticks. It's about the headline, Trump tariffs hockey sticks. Because that headline travels, it provokes, it makes Canadians feel personally targeted, and it creates the emotional pressure that's supposed to force a reaction. Its negotiation is theater, and Trump is genuinely gifted at it. Carney negotiates in the opposite register. Low volume, precise words, nothing announced that doesn't need to be announced. When he called the tariff a violation, he didn't do it with a wall of adjectives. He did it once clearly and let it sit. When he signaled openness to talks, he didn't gravel and he didn't gloat. He just left the door open on his terms. And that mismatch in style is actually a strategic advantage because Trump's approach needs a reaction to feed on. Theater without an audience response falls flat when the other side refuses to perform fear, refuses to perform outrage, refuses to give you the panic your pressure was designed to produce. The pressure starts to look like it's not landing. And pressure that visibly isn't landing is pressure that starts costing the person applying it. I want to be concrete about what intensify negotiations in the coming weeks actually means in practice, because vague phrases like that hide the real fight. It means teams sitting down repeatedly. It means the 50% tariff continuing to run while they talk, which is the pressure staying on. But it also means every one of those sessions is an opportunity for Canada to keep pointing at the Section 338 problem, to keep the legitimacy question front and center, and to make Washington's own domestic pain, the rising costs at home, part of the calculation. The coming weeks are not a countdown to a Canadian surrender. They're a window in which two clocks tick at once, and the side that stays calmest, most patient, and most legally grounded tends to come out ahead. Okay, now the honest counter-argument, because I promised you I wouldn't just tell you a comforting story, and this is where I level with you about how this could still go wrong for Canada. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Carney's whole approach depends on time, patience, and diversification actually paying off. And none of those are guaranteed. The reality is that Canada still sells the overwhelming majority of what it produces to one customer, and that customer sits right across the border. You cannot rewire 50 years of supply chains, pipelines, and export relationships in a summer or even in a year of annual reviews. The pipeline routes, the new markets, the diversification everyone talks about, those are real projects, but they're slow, expensive, and politically difficult. Meanwhile, the 50% tariff is fast. It's live and it's hurting specific Canadian industries and specific Canadian workers right now today. A winemaker in the Okanagan or a dairy farmer or a cement producer doesn't get to wait patiently for the long game to pay off. They feel it this quarter. And that creates a domestic pressure of Carney's own, because if the calm, patient, don't flinch strategy starts to look like it's costing Canadian jobs while Washington faces no consequences it can't absorb, then the political ground under Carney shifts. Canadians want to see their government stand up, and there's a limit to how long we're playing the long game. Satisfies people who are watching their livelihoods take a hit. Trump can outlast a lot of things, but he's also facing his own political calendar and his own restless base. And it's genuinely an open question which leader's domestic patience runs out first. Carney is betting his does not. That's a real bet, not a sure thing. There's also the legal question, and I don't want to oversell it. Yes, I think Section 338 is a weak foundation. Yes, I think reaching for a Depression era statute is a tell, but weak legal foundation and get struck down quickly are two very different things. Legal challenges take time. They wind through processes and panels and disputes that can drag on far longer than the political moment. So even if Canada is right on the law, being right slowly is not the same as being safe quickly. The tariff can do a lot of damage in the gap between this is illegitimate and a body with clear's throat authority has actually said so and forced it to stop. So when I tell you Carney's answer changed the negotiation, I mean it. But I want to be precise about what it changed. It changed the frame. It denied Washington the surrender it was fishing for. It kept the legitimacy question alive and kept Canada on the high ground. It forced a dynamic where both clocks tick instead of one. That's real and it matters. But it did not make the 50% tariff disappear, and it did not remove the underlying vulnerability that a single buyer economy carries into any fight like this. The frame is better than it was. The fundamentals are still hard. Both things are true at once, and anyone telling you only one of them is selling you something. Here's where I land. The phone call from Trump was supposed to be the moment Canada came to the table on Washington's terms. Instead, it became the moment Canada got the other side to reach out first, agreed to talk without accepting the tariff as the price of admission, and quietly reframed the whole confrontation around the legitimacy of the American move rather than the size of Canada's concession. That's not surrender. That's not de-escalation in the way it was reported. That's a negotiator who understood the difference between managing a bully and outpositioning one and chose the second. Whether it holds depends on things that haven't happened yet, on whether patience beats pressure, on whether the law catches up in time, on whose home crowd runs out of patience first. But the shape of the fight has changed. And it changed the moment Carney decided that calm was a strategy and not a surrender. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Is Carney's refusal to fire back the smartest move on the board, the patient play that quietly wins the long game? Or is it a gamble that leaves Canadian workers exposed while Washington keeps the pressure running and the clock ticking? Tell me in the comments, because this one is far from settled and I read them. If you got something out of this breakdown, do me a favor and subscribe to Laura Hayes' Point, because I go deep on this trade fight and the diplomacy behind it in a way most coverage just won't. Connecting the moves underneath the headlines instead of chasing the soundbite. Hit the like button so more people see this, and I'll see you in the next one, where we'll be watching exactly what intensify in the coming weeks turns into once the two sides actually sit down. Thanks for watching.